All right. So we are recording. Let's do play from the start. Okay. So this week's project is, I like to call it time and space. But so like this last week, we worked on light, which was really kind of that idea of capturing the different times of day and figuring what that is. So this week, we're going to kind of take that exposure exercise that we did and really think about how shutter speed can affect motion and time in our images, and then also thinking about focus and what that does with space. So, the interesting thing I love about photography is, I remember writing about this once, was, I in my personal work, I capture a lot of portraits. And it's always really wonderful when you kind of have a dialogue in a portrait with a subject. And it's like that moment is just captured, but it's like a 60th of a second and then it's gone, right? And so this idea of how do we do that? How do we capture just that one moment, and what happens when we start to elongate that exposure and that time that we're portraying? And so I think you probably saw a little bit about the project that Nick was working on with having multiple moments in one composition. But, within one image, how can elongated time really start to show things in an interesting way? I throw in this painting just because there was always a big argument in history about, when horses were running, whether or not all of their legs were off the ground. And then Edward Muybridge came along. Oh, I threw that in there just because I think it's funny. Little carousel picture, kind of a throwback to the painting. But, we had Edward Muybridge, and he was one of the first photographers. And like I said, in early photography, a lot of it was kind of from this scientific background. So even though, they weren't really trying to make fine art, they were often chemists and men of leisure who had time to be able to do these things. And so Edward Muybridge did all of these movement studies, and he set it up so that, he had several cameras that would fire in succession as people or animals or machines would move along his little area that he had developed, and you can see all of the lines here that are really, he was trying to depict height and speed and motion and all of this really cool stuff. And one of the neat things about his work is that we found that, the horses really, they're not necessarily all feet off the ground except for when they're cantering or whatever. So so answering that age-old question. But he created all of these really, really interesting kind of captures of movement that people hadn't really seen before, because this was pre-cinema. So we didn't see a lot of that kind of thing. And, before then it was just paintings. So there wasn't like a physical documentation of the truth of movement. And so he captured all of these really, and they're fun. I've and sometimes you could actually buy these and get a zoetrope. Do you know what a zoetrope is? So for those of you watching at home, so a zoetrope, it's like a circular carousel, I guess is the best way to think of it. And so you would put your pictures on the inside, and then when you turn it, there was like a little slit that you would look through, and it almost looked like a movie. So that was kind of the precursor to cinema. But a really interesting way to do that. I like to dream big, and so, we have no budget here for most stuff. But I always wanted to do like a huge installation where we make like a life-size zoetrope and like create stuff.
Wow.
I just thought that would be a super fun student project to work on. Someday when we have funds, we'll do that. But that'll be interesting. So next photographer I want to show you guys was Harold Edgerton, and again, another kind of more scientific guy. He was actually one of the first photographers to work with strobe lights and really, really fast shutter speeds. So the kind of work that he's doing, like these droplets, you could probably pull off with your camera at like a 4,000th of a second. It's not easy, but it's doable. He was working with strobes that actually were triggered by, he invented the system that triggered the camera and the strobe at the same time to be able to do this. But you've probably seen these images before where the apple is exploding and you've got the bullet captured and things like that. Most of our cameras today can't quite get that fast. So I don't know, I guess if you want to try having your friend shoot at something and capturing something like that, it could be fun. But I think, I can't remember what the shutter speed on these are, but it was that synchronization of strobe light and there were a lot of things that obviously had to be factored because it was like the firing of the gun and the camera and the light all at the same time. So he was, again, very scientific in kind of creating the technological way to be able to do that. He also did, this one is with a strobe light. Yeah. And so this is something that you guys could do, like the little tennis player here. A lot of the phone flashlight apps actually have like a strobe. You can download like a strobe app and, just put it on your phone and then turn your phone on and it just flashes. So you could play with something like that and a moving object or a person or something and see what happens. So that's definitely something to play with on this project.
So you set it at a super slow shutter speed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then what happens is every time, if you're in a extremely dark environment, every time the light flashes, it'll capture that movement as it progresses. Another photographer that we're thinking about when we think about time is Henri Cartier-Bresson. So he came up with this term, the decisive moment. And a lot of times when we think of the decisive moment, we think of this image in particular. And he was very much, and it's interesting, even now, like I photographed an aerial performance on Saturday night. And, you've got people swinging around in the air and they're doing all of these positions and things like that. And a lot of photographers would work in a way where they just put it on continuous shooting and they would shoot like 15, 20 shots of like a particular thing. And then they know they got the shot. But I've always been kind of this person who revels in that idea of the decisive moment. Like, I'm choosing when to click the shutter, and I find a lot of times my images are more meaningful because of that. Like if you look at somebody who does the continuous capture, they're not picking those moments, and they might, even though they've got the camera set to, like it'll take a new shot every second or something, or half a second or however crazy fast it does it new. They're not making that decision, and I find it really does make a difference if you're the one pushing the shutter. It also takes some practice and getting used to being able to anticipate and knowing the delay of your camera and all of that kind of stuff.
Right.
But it's so critical. And so back when Henri Cartier-Bresson was doing things, there was no continuous capture, so, and he was probably photographing, this one looks like it might actually be 35 millimeter, but he shot a lot of stuff in 4x5, so 4x5 camera, like you got to focus before you even put the film in because you have to use the ground glass and you've got the big thing over your head. And so, and then you're standing there with your camera release and you're just like, okay, I'm ready.
Wow.
So this particular image has always been kind of that poster child for the decisive moment. And you can see how perfect it is. He was watching this guy and he had everything set up and framed, and the little guy is kind of walking along the path there, and then right before his heel would hit the water and create a ripple, he caught that image. And so he's always been, his work is very much, again, probably sat got this all framed up. He knew he wanted this really wonderful staircase, and then waited for the right thing or person to come by. So a lot of times the decisive moment is that, anticipation and then getting the capture. I love this one.
That's crazy.
Like peeping through the fence. Yeah.
Oh. I didn't thinking, oh, I was like, what would bring their noses right against
Yeah,
the
I
wall?
can't
like
remember the story behind this one, but I feel like it's
Wow.
a highly politicized one. I think she was like
Yeah.
turning her in. Sometimes I put notes in, but then when I'm doing this, I can't read my notes. So, and he photographed all over the world. Bresson was that was also the really interesting thing. I feel like a lot of these historic photographers had so much freedom. You know, they were war photographers, and they were fine art photographers, and they were commercial photographers, and nowadays I feel like we have to be so pigeonholed to be able to make a living or whatever. But so a lot of their work can go from place to place. I don't have the photographer for this particular series, but this is kind of another way that we show the progression of time in photography is multiple images, right? You start to create a little narrative. Here's another one where, these two, I wish I had the photographer's name in here, but you have these two images that, again, start to kind of create a little bit of a visual narrative. Even, like there's not a critical, amazing story going on here, but you start to kind of see how the light changes and how the frame changes, and those pairings become more interesting because of the way they're presented. This one, like, you've got this same frame, but you've got the white car and the black car. So this is a really good example of parallelism.
Oh, yeah.
See, I can't teach two classes at the same time.
Hey, so,
Oh, hold on a second, because I'm recording.
Sorry.
I'm recording. The passage of time showing, obviously we don't have the time to do this in this particular lesson, but that idea, and there's a lot of photographers who have done things like this, like, a tree over time, a building over time, and then showing that progression. Rafael Navarro, he's the one who did the previous pairings too. This whole series is all about diptychs. And these are shot, so this is actually kind of interesting. You can see it in this particular image here. So when you see the little notches like that, this is actually what we call a contact print that was made of two 8x10 negatives. So he put the two negatives together and then just made an exposure of it in the dark room. And so that's why we get these little notches, is that's actually how you can read how to put your film in the film holders. Because all of that has to be done in complete darkness. So you have to know which way the notch goes so that it's facing the right way so that you actually take the photo correctly. Yeah, I would love to teach large format photography. Here's another diptych, this idea of, kind of time passing, right? Like you have this whole huge setup and all the wedding party, and then it's just empty, and there's the camera. Bernice Abbott. So her work, again, she was, I'm trying to remember, I feel like was a photographer in the 30s, and kind of in that same group, maybe even earlier than that. I think she was like 20s too, but hanging out with Man Ray and all the Dada artists, and like who knows what they were doing, but really kind of playing with experiment, and again she was using strobe light and long exposure to kind of play with this and figure things out and see what happens. So this is like, a ball on a string hanging from an area, and then she just kind of dropped it and let the strobe light create these really fantastic images. This one is a longer exposure, utilizing prisms. But I figured you'd be really drawn to these because of the abstractness of them, and they're very linear.
Yeah.
But she did some really, really
that's
fun
cool.
work. Ping pong ball.
Yeah. That's
And
great.
the thing I love about this is it's really, you just need a dark space and a strobe light, and then some patience and experimenting. Because, sometimes it takes a little bit of effort to figure out how long you need for it to, So it's like, okay, maybe that's 3 seconds, and how many flashes do I need, and how far apart do they have to be? So it does definitely take a little experimentation, but you can get some really cool stuff. Water ripples.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow.
I forget what this one is. But still really, really cool. I forget what that one is too. Although I feel like that could be an eclipse. Because that's what they look like. It might be. I was actually lucky enough to photograph the eclipse when it was here a couple years ago. We drove up to Wyoming with half of Colorado, and
Yeah, I went up to Wyoming.
Did you? Like, took me 10 hours to go 100 miles, but it was worth it. It was so worth it. Yeah. More, I think these are with using an oscillator. So she would, she was also a scientist. So, you know, kind of putting her camera set up, and then oscillators, they vibrate. So putting like the water and then maybe something in the water and then letting it oscillate. Those might be magnets. But playing with that to kind of capture the patterns there.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
It's magnets and like metal filings.
But again, kind of showing that movement and really, you know, how things move in time. I love her stuff. I love the wrench too. Don't throw wrenches at people. But could be fun, right? Gary Winogrand. So his work in here, I wanted to put more as a kind of expression, you know, like we were saying. So time is going to be dealing with shutter speed and kind of how can you use shutter speed to show motion, or, you know, some of that repetition that we were looking at with strobe lights and things like that. And then Gary Winogrand, I threw him in here as kind of this idea of the absence of time. So, you know, like this particular image is it's just empty, right? And so it's interesting because we don't think of time passing in this image. It's just still. And he has a lot of imagery like that, where it's like this quiet stillness, and kind of, you know, because sometimes we get into this mindset that, oh, you know, time has to be moving really fast and it needs to show motion, and maybe there's blur and all of these things. But, you know, there's the opposite side of that too, where there's a stillness and a quietness in imagery. So these are using faster shutter speeds, and kind of thinking about capturing motion and stuff like that. He was a street photographer as well, so going out in the world. I feel like we get in more trouble these days just taking random pictures of people. I think it was more, I don't know, you didn't see as many. Yeah, well, like everybody's got a camera phone now and they're doing selfies and taking pictures of everything, and you know, back then it was a little bit more obscure to see a photographer. This image in
They're
particular.
also using like the phones to prove things, or to can't think of the right word, but to get people for, like, see, I got a picture of you doing this.
Yeah.
You know, to blame people for.
Yeah, so I think people are rightly more concerned about their privacy.
Yeah, like, why are you taking a picture? I'm not doing anything.
Yeah, I'm not doing anything. Who are you?
I'm not doing anything wrong.
I agree. It's interesting, the dynamics of how being photographed has really kind of changed. This particular image with, you know, I love nobody's really looking at the camera except for this individual on the ground, the veteran, kind of creating that, again, that moment of stillness, and you're just like,
Oh my God. Whoa.
Yeah. He also did a lot of selfies.
Crazy.
So, you know, selfies have been a thing for a really, really long time. Yeah, I'm not even sure how obviously they had to kind of plan this, but super fun with like random guy flipping in the background.
In a suit.
I'm guessing they must be circus workers or something, because you're looking at, I don't know. Yeah. Not really sure about that one, but
In a suit, smoking a cigarette.
yeah. Back in the day. Dancing photography can always be really fantastic. There's a lot of photographers who have worked, there's a very rich tradition of photographers working with dancers and capturing those, you know, individual poses and things like that. Harry Callahan playing again around with, so this is actually probably a multiple exposure, although it could be, again, utilizing multiple flash in a tripod.
Huh.
So it could be either way. So he could have taken multiple images and then stacked them. But my guess is maybe he was using multiple flash. And you can do this again, with a camera app, or if you do even have an off-camera flash. Oftentimes they have a button on the back that's the reset button, and you just keep pushing it. So you can set your shutter speed to 3 seconds or whatever, and then set up your scene, have your tripod go ahead and hit the shutter release, and then you just keep firing the flash. It's kind of like light painting too, you just keep playing with it and have your subject matter move in such a way that you get these ghosted images, because the overall exposure is however many times you hit that flash, but whatever's moving is only going to have a certain amount of illumination, so it creates this really interesting kind of ghost-like appearance. Another kind of stillness moment. And a lot of these images of Harry Callahan are of his wife and daughter. This is probably, like I was saying, a multiple exposure.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, kind of the overlapping imagery. And some cameras do, I know my camera has a setting where I can actually shoot multiple exposures in digital, like in the camera. But a lot of times this kind of work nowadays is done in Photoshop. You can just take multiple images and kind of play with them. And so if you do want to experiment with this and you have this idea, I can show you how to do that here in class. We don't work a ton in Photoshop here, but this is pretty easy, so we can play around with that kind of stuff. Another little stillness. Here's a documentary image of capturing that kind of decisive moment of the body of a sailor being cast to sea. So I always wonder how he must have. I always wonder about like the vantage point of this shot. Like, was he like on the deck, like hanging over the?
Yeah.
Probably, yeah. That would have been a tough one to capture. All the expressions and people not being really great. Oh, Erica Gentry. So this is Erica Gentry is a Denver photographer. I think she teaches at DU, and she did this really fun series where a lot of the cameras these days have a panoramic option in them, and so you can set your camera to panoramic, and then you slowly kind of pan along the image. And so what she did was she took that idea of time and the panoramic image, but instead of her being the one to move the camera, she would ride on public transportation. And so, you get these really great street scenes of kind of the world going by, and the camera is struggling to capture the scene as she goes by on like the bus or whatever. And some of them are more successful than others, but again, kind of a playful experiment of like, cool. Hey, I have this option. This is what it's supposed to do, but what happens if I try this? And really playing around with, here's one where like the people get cut off, and you get some really interesting kind of shapes and feel. I actually just saw a really great photo posted the other day of somebody trying to do this, and like it was a band photo. And the guys had moved, and so their heads were like detached from their bodies. Cool. It looked really, really cool, but just kind of a playful accident. They hadn't intended that. But, you get some repetition, so kind of where the bus stops and things like that. I love this one, just because of the combination of the top time, and then you've got like the ghosted person and kind of some interesting shadows and things going on in there. Kind of a fun little playful experiment series. So here's one that's really showing movement. You can barely even see the blurred individual there. Wow. Yeah, a test, like initial test crash dummy. So getting that really, and again, this is that kind of slower shutter speed. So that's why you're getting that blur, but the focus is right there. So you kind of get that really interesting viewpoint. Another double exposure of Magritte. Yeah. With the
The famous hat.
Yeah. Cessna pot and pipe. All right. I don't know why I put that one in there.
Okay.
I'm like, I don't know why that one's in there. Oh, this one I love just
That's
because,
wonderful.
you know, even though it's black and white, you can kind of tell that that's snow. And so because that was in the shadow, the snow didn't melt there. And then this is, yeah, so again, kind of showing that idea of time passing, but it's,
wow. It's beautiful.
yeah, just a really great, you know, I mean, how often does that happen?
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, that decisive moment. So here's some student work. Light painting is always fun. It's harder than it looks. So if you want to try and write words, give it a shot. You know, you can use like a little pen, flashlight, or headlamps work really great for this kind of thing. Needs to be pretty much totally dark, and then you have to give yourself enough time to write a word, and then lots of practice of like actually how you write the word and where it is in space. But it can be fun to play with. Long exposures, kind of showing that movement. This particular image is a really good example of, well, not really good, but a pretty good example of what we call panning. So sometimes you want one part of your image in focus, which in this instance would be the cyclist, and then you want the background moving. So when you do that, if you actually follow the motion of your main subject matter, like the cyclist, and do a slower shutter speed, the cyclist should then be in focus, and the background gets this really kind of fun blurriness. It does take, sometimes this is really good to do with a tripod, but that has, you know, some of them have like a rotating wheel on them. And then you can, so that way you know that like you're going to be steady enough for a slow shutter speed.
Yeah.
But like I think that's probably what happened here. This is probably just handheld with this particular image. Again, just kind of playing with, you know, that idea of motion and slow shutter speeds.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah.
It's weird. It reminds me of my friend who has a prosthetic leg, and he wears shorts.
Nice.
And you know, you just see it.
Get used to it.
Yeah, because the one on the left looks like a prosthetic.
Yeah. Dog jumping.
Oh, great.
But I like how all the fur is captured.
Yeah.
Again, not, you know, not perfect, but pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Record player. Just kind of car passing. Oh, got that one in there twice. Festival dancers. Getting in there really close up. I thought this one's really a lovely image. Kind of more about expressing emotion than capturing people. Yeah. Playgrounds are great for this particular project. I feel like merry-go-rounds are kind of a thing of the past, but
yeah, it's unfortunate.
Yeah, but carousels and things like that can be really great.
People probably got hurt too much and sued and.
Yeah. Oh, skate parks can be great.
Wow.
It's kind of a fun. Again, like I said, this is sort of like the.
You know, Carnival is really fun.
Oh yeah, and they're all around right now too, weren't they? Maybe.
I don't know.
Maybe that time of year.
They would be if it wasn't post-COVID.
Yeah, everything's kind of slowly coming back, but there's still. I know, like for the fireworks in Fort Collins, they're calling it drive-in fireworks at the ranch. So like,
they're not doing any fireworks in Boulder.
No. Well, I mean, the weather's just crummy too. Are there?
I think so.
So here's some leaves. Somebody like threw them up in the air and captured them. So fast shutter speed. So this one's really kind of that, you know, playing with fast shutter speed and slow shutter speed, but then also thinking about quiet stillness, you know, and maybe some strobe and unusual lighting possibilities. So kind of see what you got.
You know Andy Goldsworthy? He does this.
Yeah.
He throws pigment in the air. And
then captures them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen his some of his ice sculptures that are just amazing, and then they melt.
Yeah.
I always love those. Yeah, there's a great documentary about him.
Yeah.
And that's it. So that is your challenge. End of lecture.